Not yet. I've had classes all day.
Good luck, you do.
Thank you.
Did you come to the review last lecture?
Yep. I thought it was great.
I think that you should find it fairly simple then.
Yeah, nothing looks too crazy. I'm glad there's not going to be anything like crazy complex joins or anything like that.
Nothing that you haven't seen in the review.
Yeah, exactly.
In the assignment already. Oh, I'm sorry, in the or the quizzes you've already taken.
I like your book collection.
Oh. Thanks. I'm read by my kids too, so it's ours now. Seen several generations. All right, a couple more minutes. Share my screen. Chat. All right. All right, let's get going. All right, welcome back, everyone. So we are finishing up week number 7 of our database design course. And as we have entered this second half of the semester, we're going to get started on some more advanced ways of interacting and using databases. Also, you should be preparing yourself for the midterm one, which was made available earlier today and available all throughout Monday at midnight. I sent out a poll. Wanted to do it between Friday and Sunday or Saturday and Monday, and it was evenly. I decided to give just everybody just an extra day, so it's available since today and all the way through Monday. The exam is also shorter than I expected, and it took me a while to generate all sorts of random questions, and so that was work quite an undertaking. Nevertheless, they shouldn't be that much different to what we've seen in the review earlier this week, or anything that you might have seen in the quizzes. So if you just review what we talked about on Monday and earlier this week, or any of the quizzes that we've taken, you shouldn't find anything very much different than what you've seen already. So no surprises there. So as we chatted late last week, we introduced we were going to introduce another way of interacting with the database. We had discussed the database, but from within the database, right? And we learned a new language. It was store procedures, which is it has you can create functions, you can create procedures, you can create triggers, and it has its own syntax, right? Its own data types, its own quirks about passing data into the functions and retrieving data from the functions. It has its own language on how to handle if statements and switch cases and branching and looping. It's just a a new language to learn, which is meant to be used from within the database, right? And that's as close as you can possibly get at programming a database, right? And so for the next couple of weeks, we're gonna explore other ways that we can program the database. In particular, we'll take a look at being able to program the database from outside of the database, right? And for this, there's all plethora of choices of programming languages that you can choose, and any like any other language, just like we learn programming using for procedures and functions, has its own syntax, and any other language we would have chosen, we would have to learn whatever syntax is specific to that language. In this case, we're going to be using Java for learning how to program the database, how to interact with the database. We might as well chosen Python or C# or JavaScript or any language we could have chosen. And they mostly entail the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of concepts. It usually entails first establishing a network connection to the database, then formatting a SQL query, sending that SQL query over through the connection, and then receiving a response from the database, and then doing whatever you want with that data. We talked about that there are some best practices, some patterns that are follow that that have evolved over time in industry, and these patterns go across language, across infrastructure. These are just best practices in general, regardless of what language you decide using or you end up using. These patterns are very common across across infrastructure, across languages, and they're pretty universal. So we're going to continue working with that. We'll talk some more on how to interact with the database using JDBC. JDBC is stands for Java Database Connectivity, and it's as close as you can get with MySQL or relational database, as close as you can get, but from outside, right? It's it's basically it provides all the necessary plumbing and all the necessary tooling that allows you to establish a connection with the database, format a SQL command that you can send over through the connection, receive a response, and then consume the response that comes back from the server. Later on next week, we'll take a look at an even more advanced way of doing it. JDBC is fairly low level, right? It's almost as being able to code at the command line, right? And passing, literally passing a text that you would have typed at the command line, sending it over the network, executing it, right, and then processing the results, right? So that's very low level. And next week we'll introduce an even a much higher way of thinking about database connectivity by being able to map data models that are represented either in a relational model in SQL with create statements and whatnot, how to map that relational model, how to convert it or map it automatically, or sometimes I like to say automagically, how to connect it and map it to an object model, right? That if you're using an object-oriented language, typically you create classes that represent properties that go well together, that represent a particular concept or idea. You want to be able to map the two. You want to be able to map a record, a row in some table. You like to map that into memory into an instance of an object. Okay, so that's next week. Today we're still gonna be practicing again, revisiting the use of JDBC as a means for communicating or connecting, interacting with a relational database. Okay. So let's review where we left off. Any questions before we get started? There was no assignment this week, right? The intention is that you should be fully focused on the midterm, on the exam. There will be an assignment coming up next Tuesday, which will be based on what we've been doing, what we're going to be doing today, and what we're going to be doing on Tuesday. Right, we're going to be introducing all these new ways of interacting and communicating with the database. Okay. So yeah, no assignment this week, but definitely we'll get back to the same cadence we've been using. One assignment every week, right? Again, same thing. We first we give you an example, and we walk you through a full example, and then ask you to replicate that example, right, on your own. So that once you have a chance to practice what we give you, and you get a chance to follow along and do exactly what you're told, you gain the confidence to then go on and try to do it on your own, right? So the same plan, right? That all the assignments are going to be built using that strategy. Anyway, so the source the examples that we worked on last week, I made a Git repository here, right? If you go to home and you go to modules. You go to modules here, whereas the first module is resources, and the source code, the Java source code that we played around with last week, I made it available right here, Java Git repository. If you click there, you come to this repository, and here you will find the source code that we played around with last week, right? We went to, I think all our stuff was in. Let's see, DAOs. Yeah, there's our blog DAO. I remember that, where we had the source code of establishing the connection with the JDBC driver. We had the local hosts, right? We connected to the local database using 3200 as their username and password, right? We went and implemented the find all blogs. We implemented find a blog by a unique identifier. And I think that's it. Did we do a create blog? Maybe we didn't. Oh, there we go. We left it. We left it unimplemented. Right, so today we're going to go a little farther. We'll practice again. Again, the idea is that I understand that this might be overwhelming at first, right? There's like any new language. I imagine you must have felt the same way when you were just introducing stored procedures and functions, and same way when we talked about triggers. Right? But each assignment will give you a chance to practice this, and the idea is that as you practice, things will become more and more easier. Right? We practice, right? And the idea is that you find a pattern. Right? And all this learning is all about finding patterns, right? And once you identify the pattern, you can say, oh, okay, I see the pattern. And I can now replicate that pattern. Okay. So anyway, so we're going to clone this code. You can download it. You can download the code. You can get the source code in different ways. You can download the whole thing as a file, and you can unzip it to your local directory, or you can copy this URL and then you can clone it down using Git. Right? I'm not sure if you're familiar with Git. But it's a very common tool in software engineering that allows for software engineers to share code, in particular the repository, or any updates I would make, any bug fixes I would push here, and folks can then pull down any updates to that source code. So it's a very common tool that software engineers use, and you start. I don't know if you have a chance to play around with Git in other courses, but definitely it's a must. To learn how to use Git at some point, right? And if you haven't, then this is a great time to start playing around with it. Anyway, I'm going to copy this URL, and I'm going to go to a terminal, console. And this is the same thing if you're using Mac or PC. you go to a terminal, and I'm going to go into a directory where I can bring down all this source code. Okay, so I'm going to go into NEU, and then 2021. And what do we have there? We have Spring. Let's go to Spring. Go to 3200. And here I'm going to clone that source code. Okay, so you say git clone, and that URL that I copied. Right. Again, you can either do it this way, or you can download the entire zip code, the zip, and then unzip it. Right. Either way, at the end, you're going to end up with a directory. Okay. Notice that now we have a directory. There it is. I can now go into that directory. Okay. So we are in that directory that I just cloned all that source code. Okay? And you can do that as well. You can clone it or download the zip. Once we have that, I'm going to open up with my favorite IDE. It doesn't matter which IDE you use. I prefer to use Intellij. It's a very common in integrated development environment, very common amongst software engineers. But if you prefer Eclipse, or you can even use Notepad, that's fine. Whatever text editor you prefer. Also free. Yes, Intellij is free for students. If you register with your NEU ID or with your Northeastern email, you get at least a year free for the Intellij tool. And they have a tremendous suite of tools that are free for faculty and students, and absolutely a must for in your toolbox. Anyway, so let me bring up Intellij. Again, you could use Notepad if it's fine, or you could use Microsoft Visual Code as well. Any IDE will work. Intellij has quite a few tricks up its sleeve, and a lot of plumbing and tooling that make life a little easier. But there's nothing that I'm going to show you that you can't do just with a plain old text editor. All right, so let's open that directory I just created. Spring 3200, and those are the directory we just created. Just open that up. Okay, so let's just review what we did about a week ago. Yeah, a week ago. Let's see, it's still parsing project. Okay, so let's see. We spent some time and we built two things last week, right? We built a Java class that represents a blog, right? And we based the structure of this class based on the table that we want to connect to. Right? We know that there's a blog table, right, that has an ID that is an int. We know that there's a name, there's a varchar. We know there's a topic was also a varchar. We know that there's created and updated, which are timestamp. Right? And we know that there's a link to the user as a foreign key. Right? And we know that right now that's just an integer. Later on, next week, we're going to augment this to be much more powerful than just an ID, an integer. Okay, but we'll do that. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We also implemented this blog DAO, and the blog DAO was is based on JDBC, right? That basically uses interfaces that are declared inside the java.sql library or package, right? And then each vendor, whether it's MySQL or Oracle or Postgre or any server that wants to participate in the Java community, right, that wants to cater to Java developers, they provide a connector or a set of libraries that in particular we downloaded. The libraries are for MySQL, and those libraries inside they have classes that implement the interfaces that are declared in there. Right? So MySQL's implementation is different than Oracle's implementation, right? But the idea is that they all have the same API, right? They all implement the same functions, the same data types. They implement the same behavior, right? So from a Java developer point of view, I don't really care whether I'm using MySQL or I'm using SQL Server or Oracle or any vendor. It doesn't matter. I am shielded from the idiosyncrasies or the details of any vendor. I'm shielded because they all implement the same interface, right? So the class in MySQL might be called MySQL driver something or other. In Oracle, it might be my Oracle driver or whatever. But they all implement the same interfaces: the connection interface, the statement interface, and the results set interface, right? And that's how we are able to code the same, use the same piece of code and use it for connecting for any vendor. Right? So the way we did this is that, for instance, we implemented find all blocks, and we're following a design pattern called the data access object pattern. And in that pattern, it says that it's a good practice to encapsulate in a single class or in a single set of classes all the interaction with the database, right? So that the rest of the application, right, doesn't have to deal with knowing how to connect to a database, how to grab things from the database. Instead, everything is hidden inside of this function. This function knows what to do, how to retrieve all the block records from the database, right? So that the rest of the application just don't care, right? It only sees, right? The rest of the application just sees this this signature, this function signature. This is, if I call this, I'm going to get an array of blogs. That's fine. That's perfect. Okay, so I don't, the rest of the application doesn't have to deal with the fact that I need to establish a connection. I need to handle some exceptions. I need to create a statement. I need to iterate over a result set. All that is hidden inside of this function. Again, that's very common in software engineering practice, right? It's information hiding, right? It's applying the information hiding principle in software engineering, right? We hide all these details from the rest of the application. So in here, we know all the details, right? We need to first, again, the steps are always the same. You establish a connection, you create a statement, you execute that statement that goes out to the server comes back with the result, right? And then you process that result. Okay, those are the same steps, always the same. So how do we grab a connection? We first initialize the driver, and this driver might be the Oracle driver, the MySQL driver, whatever driver vendor we're interacting with. From that driver, we get a connection by logging in with username and password and the URL where the server is located in the internet, right? And this could be a server that is running locally on our machine, or this could be a server halfway across the world. As long as you know the URL, you can connect to any database for which you have a username and password. Okay, so this could be certainly something that is being hosted on AWS. As long as you know the URL and the username and password, you can connect to anybody in the world. We connect to the database, right? We create a statement, same step as always. We format some SQL executable, right, that we're going to send over to the server. We execute the query, right? Query as in we're asking for data, query, right? As opposed to execute an update, right? Because the statement can be either a query with a select statement, or it can be an update. If you're doing an insert, update, and delete, those are considered updates, okay? But select statements are considered queries. So we execute the query and comes back with the result set, and then we're going to process the results, the rows that come back from that query. Okay, so results has functions that allow you to retrieve each one of the fields or the columns in the record, right? And we know that the records are coming back with columns such as ID, name, topic, right? Because we know that's the schema that we created when we created the table, right? And we retrieve each column one at a time. We know their original data type, that these were integers or varchars or timestamps, right? And we're converting it into Java equivalent Java data types, right? The int equivalent of Java is integer. The equivalent of varchar in Java is string, and so on and so forth, right? And we have getters for each one of them, with the correct data type. And finally, the user ID. We retrieve the user ID. There it is. Now we have chosen to grab all these low-level primitive data types, right? All these fields, these 6 fields, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fields, and we're going to collect them into an object. Okay, we call it the blog object, right? And we declared it in this blog class. So this blog class is the equivalent of the create statement in SQL. Right? The way you establish the structure of the data or the schema of the data in SQL is you create a create table statement. Yes, in there you establish all the column names and the data types, column data type, and all the defaults and all that, right? Well, the Java class or C# class or Python class or any object-oriented language, right? Classes, they all follow, or they all play the same role. They establish the data model, right? The structure of the data. Now, just like the create statement establishes the structure in a relational database, the class allows you to establish the data structure, right, in an object-oriented programming language. Make sense? And we need to be able to map these two worlds. We need to interface these two worlds, right? Because the database world is a long-term storage world, right? It's a giga trillion huge amounts of storage that is stored there for eternity, whereas the programming application world is a very small piece of memory, right? At most gigabytes, maybe. And they're very ephemeral, right? They are transient. You instantiate an object today, you instantiate an object 1 minute, and the next minute it's gone, right? Because we instantiate it in memory, in RAM, and RAM is very volatile, right? Data comes and goes all the time. So we need to, one of the challenges in when you're creating databases and you need to interact with these databases, right, is how do you bridge these two worlds, right? Where one is designed for long-term storage, dealing with bazillions of records, and how do you map that to a world that is very transient, right? Where that you're ever going to be able to see maybe just a small snippet of the entire data set that is stored in the database. Here, we're only going to ever see a small copy, right, of that data that lives in the database. Make sense? So this is only going to be ever a small, cache, right, or a copy of the original data in the database. So we create a structure, and this structure is what we call the object data model, right? We are establishing the structure in using object-oriented data models, right? Whereas in relational databases, we use the relational model, and we're mapping the two, the object data model and the relational model, right? And we're doing it by hand. How do we do it? Right? We instantiate an instance of the blog, and then we just copy or initialize, right, each one of the data that we got from each one of the columns. From a record, we copy them from each column, and then we populate our object model, right? The data that the instance object that we just created, right? So basically, we're just copying from one world to the CPU or the RAM world, right? So this is an object that lives in RAM. It's transient. It could go away whenever, right? Also, we are adding it to an array of blocks here, and then we are returning that list of blocks. Okay, We played around with this from main. Main here it's representing our application, right? Right now, it's a very trivial application. It's not doing very much, right? It's creating the DAO. And we saw that we were able to, right? We saw that we were able to use it, right? Use the find all blogs to retrieve it, right? To retrieve all the blogs and then just print them out. Okay, and so just to illustrate and to demonstrate, we can just run that. Run it. So this is, again, establishing the connection, sending over the SQL message, right? The SQL statement, right? And then it's going to retrieve the result set, and then we're just printing out each one of the records, right, as objects, blog objects. Yes. All right. So yeah. So that's where we left off last time we met. And so today we're going to do a little more. Let's practice this some more. Right, so let's see. We also implemented a couple more things. Let's see. We implemented find. We also implemented find blog by ID, right? Which is, notice that the code is almost identical, right? You know, as we would typically find. We would typically try to find ways where we don't have to copy paste the same code over and over. You know, find a way that we can reuse some of this code, right? But just to illustrate, it's the same set of steps, right? We first grab the JDBC driver, we get the connection, we create the statements, right? We format the SQL statement we want to send over to the server, right? In this case, it's a select star from blogs where ID equals blog ID, right? It's literally what we would type at the console, right, or at a SQL file if we were interacting directly with MySQL, right? We send that over. Again, this is a query, meaning we are retrieving data, and we're assigning it to the result set. Okay? The only difference between this and the other implementation is that we know that because we're doing the primary key, that the result set should, right? We know that it's a primary key, that it should come back with a single record, right? So it's slightly different the way we are going to consume this data. In the previous one, we use a while, right? And find all blogs. And find all blogs, we use the while. And because we know there might be more than one record, there could be no records, right? But it could be more. It could be 30, 40 records, thousands of records. So we're just going to consume one row at a time until, you know, results.next comes back as false, and then we're done. There are no more rows to consume. Here, the difference was that we know that it's only one of them. I mean, we could have used while. You know, that would have been okay. We still would know that while loop would execute only once. So instead of using a while loop, you know, because we know that there's only one, right, we decided to use an if statement, right, which is much more appropriate because we know there's only one of them. Okay, but internally it's the same thing, right? We read each column, right, into local variables, and then we populate our blog object. Okay, once we have our blog object, we can just return that one blog object. Make sense, right? And I think we illustrated that. We illustrated that by retrieving the SpaceX record. Right, we ran this. And so it's connected to a database. And there it is. It found the SpaceX database record. Make sense? All right, any questions? This is just reviewing what we did last week. Any questions? My intent is that we're going to practice this a couple more times, and hopefully as we practice it, you will feel more comfortable and you will gain confidence, right, that eventually you'll be able to do this on your own. Obviously, the assignment is going to help as well, give you a chance to do it on your own. Okay, so let's keep going. Let's see. So notice that we're kind of doing a little bit what we had done already in the previous assignment, right? Remember that we had asked you to implement several store procedures that that implemented several very common CRUD operations, right? Create, right? Update, delete, right? And read, so CRUD, right? Create, read, update, and delete. And here we're kind of doing the same thing, right? We implemented a couple of read operations, right? Find a blog by ID, or find all the blogs, right? And we never implemented the other ones. We never implemented create or update or delete. Let's use this as an opportunity to practice these using these implementing these operations, right? You'll find yourself that these are the most common types of operations you will be implementing whenever you're interacting with the database. And these are the most common 4 or 5 operations that you'll be implementing over and over and over, right? Whenever you're interacting with any table, right? It's all the CRUD. Be able to create a record, be able to retrieve a specific record, be able to retrieve all the records that you iterate over. You'll be able to delete a record or update a record. Those are the most common. Right? Obviously, there's many more that you can implement, but those are the most trivial ones, the most common that you implement. So let's implement. Let's see. Create blog, right? So let's implement create blog. So as the name suggests, you are creating a blog, and usually it means that you're passing some information about that blog, right? And blogs. I believe blogs have what? Blogs have have an ID, which we're not gonna create because the insert probably it's auto incremented. So, but they have a string for name and maybe a topic for also as a string. So let's implement a create function that allows you to pass the name of the brand new blog and the topic so that it inserts that in the database so we can test it. So let's do that. So let's do a create and accept a name, blog name, and a topic. Okay, and the code for connecting is almost always the same thing, right? What do? You create a connection. Right, you do the statement. You do a class for name, so class dot for name, and what was it called? JDBC driver. There we go. That's going to throw an exception, right? So we can add an exception to the signature. We can then grab the connection. So connection equals driver manager dot get connection, and the connection, I think we get the URL. So URL, the database, the DB URL, the URL. We need the username, user, and the password. There we go. Once we have the connection, we can create a statement. So the statement, you can create the statement. And here's where you can execute the statement. So this the SQL statement that we want to implement, right? It's going to be create. Be something like create, insert, right? Insert into the table. I believe it's called blogs, right? And the columns that we're going to be populating are the name and the topic, and then the values, right, is values. Can't type today, jeez. And here's the actual values that we have, right? This name and this topic. So we can just concatenate it in here. Right? So this will be name, and this will be the topic. Okay, so that builds the URL. I mean the SQL statement, right? So this is not a query, right? So we're not retrieving data from the database. Instead, we are updating the database. Right? We're putting data into the database. So this statement, notice that it has a create. There's an execute query, but there's also an execute update, right? If you're doing a select statement, then it would be a query. But if you're doing an insert, update, or delete, then you use execute update, okay? And here we can pass in the actual SQL there. And this this update execute update, right, does not return a result set. Right? If you remember, if you do a select statement, then it returns rows that that meet your criteria. Here, inserts, update, and deletes don't return rows. Right? So it would make no sense to assign this to a result set. Instead, what comes back, right, is whether this succeeded or not. Right? The return type of this is an integer saying, yeah, everything's good. Right? So what we're going to do is that we're going to return the return, and returns an integer. So let's change this to an integer. Oops. Okay, so there it is. So this allows us to insert a new blog. All right, so let's try it out. Let's try it out. Let's what we'll do is that let's comment this out. And what we'll do is that we're going to create a blog first. We'll create a blog, and then we're going to ask for all the blogs so that hopefully our new blog will be listed as the latest blog that we just inserted. Right, so let's do that. We'll say DAO create blog, and so the name of the blog, DB design section 3. Okay, spring 2021. Okay, and then the topic will be, the topic is, remember the topic is either space or cars, right? So we'll do space for SpaceX. So that we'll create that, and then right after that, we're going to ask for all the blogs and print them, and hopefully our brand new blog will be among those blogs that we retrieve. Let's run this. Oops, it says that we have an error in our syntax. Design, section 3, near, blah, 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 3. Oh, I think I have a missing parenthesis somewhere. Oh, wait, design, blah, 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 space at line 1. And what is our syntax error? Let's see. One useful thing that we might want to do here is to print our statement, see if it's okay. So let's print out the SQL. Do you need to add the quotes around the strings? Oh, yes, good catch. Yes, we need to add all those quotes. Very good. Quote, 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 and quote here. Let's try it out again. All right, so this time it worked. Notice that indeed it was able to insert it, and it's the 20-second record. Okay, so yeah, so we were able to print that out. Perfect, excellent. How about now doing a couple more things? How about deleting a blog? Right, deleting a blog, and let's implement that. So to delete a blog, usually you will need the ID of the blog that you want to remove. Right? So for instance, say you wanted to remove blog number 20, you would give me the ID of the blog, and then we would remove it. Right? So let's do that. So for instance, the data type would be the ID. It says, why do you put ++ around the string variable? Yeah, let me show you that. What I'm doing here is that I'm concatenating. This is string concatenation. Right? I'm just saying, the string concatenated with name, concatenated with whatever. Yeah, it's just adding and concatenating. Different languages will have different characters for string concatenation. In Java, it's just the plus sign. Okay. Yeah. So let's grab here the blog ID. So ID, and again, the code is almost always the same thing, right? You do a connection, right? And you do the statement. Okay. I am deliberately repeating this so that you understand that it's always the same code, right? That looks very, very similar. So yeah, so we do a class dot for name, and this is the driver. MySQL, what was the driver called? I forget. JDBC driver. I'm being lazy. I'm just throwing all these exceptions. Then here we're going to do the connection equal driver manager dot get connection, the DB URL, the username, the password, right? And this is going to throw an exception as well. So I'm just going to add the exception to the signature. And then the same thing, we want to delete a blog, right? So the SQL statement, well, let's create a statement. So statement dot will be connection dot create statement, and then statement dot we need a SQL, right? So we need the SQL statement will be what? Will be delete from blogs, right? Where the ID equal, and then we'll concatenate the ID that we're passing at the end, right? So we're going to execute the update, the SQL, and we're going to return the results. We're going to return the results, so it's an integer. Okay, so let's try it out. Let's remove this this blog, random blog we created, number 6, that has whose ID is 20, right? So let's head over down here, and instead of creating a blog, we're going to delete a blog. So dow.delete blog and pass number 20, and then retrieve all the blogs, and hopefully blog number 20 won't be there anymore. Okay, so let's run this again. Let's see. All right, notice that it jumps from 19 to 22. So blog number 20 is no longer there. All right, so finally, let's update. Let's update a blog. And so update. Let's implement update. Right. Again, same code. I'm just going to copy this. I'm just going to copy most of this, and I'm going to put it in there. And we'll need to throw some exceptions here. Exception. There we go. And this returns is going to return an integer. Okay, so but here instead of a delete, we want to update. So for instance, maybe a new title. Okay, so you can change the title. So you need also you need the ID of the record that you want to update, right? So for instance, maybe we want to change the title for the for this random blog number 20. So I need the ID of the blog that I want to change and values for whatever new field update. So for now, let's try and change the title. Okay. So we'll take in the as integer the ID of the blog, and we'll take in a string new title. Okay. And so our SQL will be something like update blogs where the ID is that, right? And we want to set new values. Okay, so we're going to say set, and then the fields we want to change. So for now, we're just going to change the title. So this will be title, right, is equal to double single quotes, and then and then this will be the new title. Okay, and that will be our SQL statement. We execute the update, and then we return the result set. Not the result set. Okay, so let's try it out. Let's change this random block 76, which is ID is 19. We'll change it to something else. Right, so we'll say, let's comment that out. And this will be DAO, that update blog. We'll change blog number 19, and we'll change it to my brand new blog. Okay, so hopefully now when we play all the blogs, number 19 will have changed to my brand new blog. Okay, so let's take a look at. So it used to be random blog 76. We'll change it to my brand new blog. So let's run that. That's blog number 19. Keep an eye on that. Running. And something went wrong. Unknown column title. Oh, maybe it's not title. Maybe it's name. Probably it's name, right? Yeah. So updates. Where's our update? Oops, where update go? Update. Oh yeah, I guess it's not title, it's name. Really, it's name? Oh, okay. So let's change this to new name. There we go. Let's try it out. Let's run it. All right, there it is. See, now blog number 19 is new name changed to my brand new blog. Make sense? Everybody good? All right, excellent. All right, so let's switch topics now, and this is something that we're going to come back to a little later in much more in depth. But I want to introduce to you some really cool things that you can do with this. Okay. So yeah, so we have a mechanism for talking to a remote database from Java, right? And this remote database could be halfway across the world, right? As long as we know the URL and we know the username and password, we're good. Right? Now, but we're still, the application that we can build around this, the kind of like the, we have to choose at some point the user interface that we're going to use that is going to build the application that. Who's going to use who is going to use this DAL, right? Who's going to use that? Is the application a phone application, right? Is it a desktop application? Is it a web application? What is it? Okay. So one common thing that has become more and more common in today's industry is to create or wrap our data, right, in a interface, right, that is compatible with anyone. Okay, and at the turn of the century, this century, when we changed to 21st century, folks went crazy, looking for ways of making it easy for applications to interact with one another, right? A lot of companies had lots of legacy data that they had accumulated over decades, right? Financial data, user data, all sorts of things that it was just sitting in their databases, and it had value to their enterprise and it had value, within their company, but they were saying, wait a minute, if we were able to share this data with other folks, wow, this could have potentially tremendous value, right, with other folks, right? And what folks were imagining back then is, they were imagining, hey, if I could have automate as much as possible the process, and I could eliminate human intervention and automate as much as possible, the productivity of our process could skyrocket. But for that to happen, we need to find ways, standard ways for databases to interact with one another, right? And that it was a very hard problem to solve because as as companies grew, right, it would happen that that growth could have been because of acquisitions, right, merging with other companies, or just the normal friction of applications of companies. You have a plethora of different infrastructures that are available throughout the enterprise, right? Some team over there is using MySQL. This other team is using Oracle. This other folks are using Mongo, and you get this plethora of disparate systems that are their own island, and so it makes it much harder for the enterprise within to share data amongst themselves. Never mind share data with their partners, right? Imagine the complexity of a company, say Ford Motor Company, that is building thousands of cars. It needs to do interactions with their suppliers, right? They need to buy the raw materials. They have to buy the tires and the windshields and the seats and all the instrumentation. And this is from many different vendors, right? Each one with their own databases, right? Each one with their own data structures, and it's just a mess. It's just to interact with suppliers, right? But then now I have to also interact with financial institutions, right? That I need to make sure that I have enough money to pay for payroll, right? I need to interact with the governments, right? Making sure that I have the right licenses. So when you're talking about large institutions, you're talking about not just one rinky-dinky database, right? You're talking about hundreds, thousands of databases that need to work together, right? And the smoother the interaction that you can make it, the more productive you can be, right? Ideally, you want to remove the necessity of people to be able to have to enter things manually, right? Or having to talk to somebody on the phone and dictate data from the screen, right? Ideally, things just flow. Data just flows between the different databases, between the different systems. So in the early 21st century, people were trying to solve this problem. How do we do that? And one of the things that came to mind was, well, we need to agree at least on a transport layer, right? How are we going to transport the data back and forth? So that was one of the things that needed to be identified. The other one is, how are we going to format that data, right? Because each database represents their data completely differently, usually in some binary format, right? That my JDBC knows how to talk to the database in that binary format. But that's very proprietary. How can we open this up so that folks could talk to one another? And the solution back then was that large organizations, like Microsoft and Sun Microsystems and Oracle and lots of huge players decided on, we're going to use the common language. How we're going to represent the data is we're going to use XML. XML. XML was became very, very popular early 21st century, and so now it doesn't matter how MySQL represents its data, or how Oracle represents its data, or how Postgre, right? We would like to be able to create a wrapper, proprietary representation, and provide some standard, right? So we're all going to talk XML, okay? And this became very, very popular, extremely popular. Then halfway through the first decade of the 21st century, web applications became just exploded, right? And it became clear that the data going back and forth between the applications built as web in web using JavaScript and using all this, and the data going back and forth between the servers and going into databases and retrieving this data, the format, most of the format of the data that was being shuffled back and forth between in the networks, right, was not being formatted as XML. Instead, it was being formatted as JSON. JSON became now kind of like the standard way of formatting data, when you're exchanging data between systems, right? So that now, I would say, maybe halfway to 2005, 2010, the standard somewhat changed away from XML, and now JSON kind of became the standard on how is it that databases and systems can share data amongst themselves. So a lot of the early work here was to, now that you have data, now that you can retrieve data from your database, what's the easiest way that you can give me a JSON representation of that data so that I can easily integrate with that data, right? So I don't need to know the proprietary communication protocol to talk to MySQL, right? To talk to Oracle, to talk to any database. As long as you can wrap this data in some standard format, I can integrate. I can write any application, right? As long as the format is standard, right? So I don't have to know any particular. So let me show you how you would do this here. Okay, so we know we can connect to the database. We know that we have all those various operations, all the finders, yes? And so how can we wrap that with a JSON layer, right? That we can retrieve that data using JSON. It's very easy, very, very easy. It's the same data right here, which we're just spitting out as strings. Right? We want to format it in a standard format, okay? So let's do that. So the first step is that you can decorate in Java, and C# you can do the same thing. In Python you can do exactly the same thing. You can decorate the object or class that you want to expose, that you want to wrap and make it a JSON wrapper around this, so I can retrieve data using JSON by using, in this case in Java, is the REST controller annotation, right? REST controller. Boom, that's it. This is now available as JSON. Okay. The only other thing that you need to do is define where's the data coming from, who's providing the data. Well, the ones that are providing the data, well, not only the data, are also providing all the actions, right? All the manipulation of the data, right? Not only retrieving of the data, but also the creating of the data and updating of the data. Who's implementing that? Well, we have create blog, we have find all blogs, we have find blog by ID, we have update blog, delete blog, and that's it. Those are the main operations. So those are the main entry points, right, to the data. I can create, I can read, I can update, I can delete. Those are the most common things that I would like to do anyway. So let's look at this one, find all blogs. I would like to be able to retrieve the data in a way that I don't need to actually run this, right? Presumably this would be running all the time, right? And if anybody can come in here and says, hey, I want you, give me all that all that data, all these blogs. This would respond saying, oh, here we go. These are all the blogs. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use another annotation that is going to be called get mapping, right? So get mapping. Where does this come from? Well, remember we said that folks were looking for standard ways of sharing data amongst multiple disparate systems, right? That were being, fractioned, or they were becoming fractured, right, into different islands of data. And one of the first problems they wanted to solve is, well, what is the transport layer, right? Who's going to transport this data back and forth? And what they found was that the easiest way that folks could share data amongst themselves was by using what already had become, the most prolific and ubiquitous way that folks were communicating back in 2000, right? And it was the web, right? Folks were using the internet, you know, and not only just internet, but they were using HTTP, right, as the main way of communicating, right? Sending email, sending, you know, just creating blogs, creating all sorts of content. Folks were just using HTTP for everything, right? Back and forth. So, and HTTP provides the protocol commands such as being able to get data, right, or post or send data, or delete data, or update data. So HTTP already provides many of the verbs or the actions that map very well to this. So get, right, in HTTP means I want to retrieve data, which is perfectly for find all blogs. Right? I want to retrieve the data. And the other thing is that, you know, HTTP typically, the way you retrieve data from any HTTP website, right, is that typically you provide a URL. Now, the URL, it tells you what data do you want. Right? You navigate to a website, you provide a URL, right? And so here you can type the URL that you want to use here. Right? You want to map this data that has been provided to a URL, and the URL here could be anything, right? So let's map it to, you know, find all blogs, right? And this is arbitrary. I can decide whatever block, whatever URL I want it to be. Okay, so let's try it out. So here, we've been running blog.dow. We've been running blog.dow, but instead, notice that there's a demo application here. So all this is going to be hosted inside of an HTTP server, right? That understands HTTP. You know, when you send HTTP requests, and is going to be able to execute this whenever it sees that in the URL. Right? So let's run that. So this demo application, we're going to say right-click and then run. Okay, starting up. And notice that it says that the server is listening at port 8080. Okay, and the and at my current IP address, right? My current IP address, everybody's IP address, localhost, right? You can either use localhost or 127.0.0.1, right? That's the current machine that you're on. So let's do that. If you go here and you open up, localhost, and then it's listening at 8080. We saw that it was listening at 8080, and then the URL, I believe it says something, find all blogs. There it is, right? There's data that came from the server, came to the database. It did the query to the database. It retrieved all those records. It created all those blog objects. It made an array out of it, right? And that's what we're getting here. Notice the square bracket. Square bracket meaning this is an array. And the curly brackets means that this is an object instance. And then all these attributes, right? ID, name, topic, those are the properties of the Java objects, right? That have their setters and getters, right? And has the same spelling, right? It has the same uppercase, lowercase, you know, any case changes would be listed here, right? And now, you know, any infrastructure that wants to integrate, right, with my database, they don't need to log in, right? They don't need to know how to connect to the database. They don't need to go into the console and type any SQL. They don't need to even know SQL. They don't even care that this is an actual SQL database or relational database, right? As far as they're concerned, this URL just returns data. See? So as long as I can now advertise to my colleagues and all my partners, right? If they want to integrate with my database, right? They can follow this URL, right? Anywhere in the world, right? As long as they know my IP address is 127.0.0.1, right? If they know my IP address of this machine on the web, right? They can come and retrieve this data from anywhere in the world as long as they know their IP address. Okay. So not only can I retrieve data, I can also maybe retrieve an individual record. Now, obviously, here we're playing around just with dummy data. These are blogs, but I mean, you can certainly imagine this Ford Motor Company, integrating with their providers, and maybe you want to see the orders of how many tires I need, or what's my inventory of windshields and my any fixtures that I need in my car, right? This would allow the integration and the automation of disparate systems to integrate amongst each other, right? So let's do one more. How about being able to retrieve an individual blog, right? So for instance, I like to be able to retrieve a blog. So find blog, and then, but I need to provide the ID. I need to pass data and say, okay, well, the ID, I'm going to pass it to you as a parameter. Find blog, and I'll pass you the ID of the blog that I want as part of the URL. Okay, so for instance, I'm going to pass you at the end here the ID. Notice the curly bracket. Curly bracket means that it is not a hard-coded piece of text, right? Instead, right, what this is going to do is going to parse that last piece, right, of that URL, and it's going to pass it to me as an attribute, as a parameter, and I'd like it to be passed to blog ID, right? So I want to map this ID into this blog ID. That's easy. Let's do that. Okay, the way you do that is that you say that I'm going to look at the parameter and say it's a path variable, okay, that is called ID, right? And it's going to receive it through here, right? So I'm going to parse this from the placeholder, and I'm going to pass it to you here in the blog ID. Make sense? All right. So let's do that, and it's going to retrieve, as the name suggests, it's going to retrieve the blog for that ID, right? And it's going to give it back as a blog. All right, let's try it out. Let's restart the server. Restart the server. Okay, so we know all these blogs. We know their IDs. There they are, 2, 3, right? So let's refresh. Oops. There we go. Now we have another ID. So it's blog. And then let's say number 3. Again, number 3, we know space tag, so it's 3. There it is. So we can retrieve a single object, right? Again, formatted using this standard JSON format that has become, ubiquitous in industry. It's as common as bread and butter. Let's do a couple more. How about I want to be able to maybe delete, right? Let's do a delete. Let's see, we want to maybe delete a blog. So maybe we want to say, get mapping, and we can say, delete blog, and then I need to provide the ID of the blog, right? Same thing. We're going to parse it from here, and then we're going to pass it the ID. Okay. All right, let's try it out. Restart the server. Again, this is tremendous, right? This allows you to integrate systems that might otherwise be impossible for them to talk to one another, because one talks Java, the other one talks Python, the other one talks C#. One is using MySQL, the other one Oracle, the other one it's just impossible, right? But as long as we agree on the transport layer, and we all agree on the right, then obviously that makes it so much easier for everybody to speak to one another. All right, so let's go back and let's retrieve all blogs. So let's remove a blog. Let's see. Let's remove my brand new blog. So 19. So we'll say delete blog, and then number 19. Okay, we'll delete that. Okay, it comes back as 1, meaning presumably it's successful. Let's go back and refresh. There it is. Notice that it skips from 17, 18, it skipped over 19, right? So it's gone. right? So again, I can update data, I can retrieve data. Right? Let's try another one. So yeah, so find. Let's create a blog. How's that? Let's create a blog. So we'll say, we can say get mapping, right? We could say create blog, right? And then we can pass maybe the name and the topic, right? Not only the ID, we can pass the name and the topic. So name and topic. Okay, and here we can then map it to each one of these, right? Say path variable, the name, and same thing for the topic. We can pass you both. And what are you going to return? You're going to return just an integer whether it was successful or not. Okay. All right, let's restart the server. And let's first retrieve all the blogs, and then we'll create a brand new blog with the name and the topic. Okay, so we have 22, right? ID up to 22. Let's create a brand new one. So maybe in a separate URL, maybe over here. So localhost 8080. Let's say create blog, my new blog, and the topic is space. Space. Okay. So enter it, comes back as 1. Presumably it was successful. Let's go back here and let's refresh. There it is. See, number 23 has the new blog, right? And finally, let's do an update. So the update looks very similar to this one. There's update right here. And this is update blog. And this first one is the ID. And then the name. You can change the name. Right, so we'll map both of these to path variables. And I'll pass you the ID. And then I'll pass you the new name. Name to new name. Okay. Okay. Let's restart. The server's starting up. Oops. Run. Okay. All right. Let's refresh. We have all those. Let's see. And let's just rename this. Okay. Some from my new blog to something else, and the ID is 23. So we'll go here and we'll say blog, it says update blog number 23, and then the new name is my new and improved blog. Okay, it comes back as 1. We'll come back to 23. Let's refresh that. So it used to be called my new blog. We refresh. Notice that now it's my new and improved blog. Right, so there we go. So we've demonstrated that we can not only can we connect to the database using JDBC, but we can expose our data model, right, to the world, right? So that if anybody wants to interact with us and execute queries or updates in the database, anybody can. We can integrate with anybody, who knows how to talk with these very standard, very easy to interact with endpoints, right? All right, so let's go a little further. Let's go a little further. And this is starting to introduce some topics that we'll come back to a little later. Right? But as we approach towards the end of the semester, right, you need to start thinking about a database, a project, right? And whatever project you decide to work on, you'll have to start thinking on how is it that folks are going to interact with it, right? With whatever you're thinking of implementing. So you have to think about some kind of user interface, right? So I'm going to get you started on what the user interface might look like. And now that we have these endpoints, now that we have these URLs and that we can retrieve data, get, post, put, delete, whatever, right? Now it broadens, you know, your possibilities on how you could interact with the database, right? This could be a phone application, right? This could be definitely a desktop application. It could be a web application. You know, whatever you can think of, right? As long as you can interact with those endpoints, you know, you can integrate with it, right? So it broadens the possibilities of what you can, how you can interact with the database. So let me just show you here. So we're going to here in web app, right? I'm going to create a very trivial HTML form that is going to allow us to interact with this. So let's see, I'm going to create here, and we'll call the page, I'll call it blogs. Okay, and in here, right, we'll call this, we'll say this is h1 blogs, and let's run it just to see, make sure that it's there. So here we can say localhost 8080 blogs. There we go. So that's the page, right? This is the page. And what could we do from the page, right? So again, most of the operations of any user interface will deal with those, at least those 5 operations, right? Create an instance of whatever that is, right? Delete, you know, CRUD, right? Create, read, update, delete. So let's first take a look at the simple ones, right? And retrieving data. So maybe let's create a list, right? And let's create a hyperlink. Instead of me typing the hyperlink, right? I can create instead of me typing the URL, let's copy the URL here. You know, here's find all blogs. So let's copy that. And I'll call this find all blogs. So now blogs, if I refresh, I have the hyperlink there. See that? If I click on the hyperlink, it returns all the blogs, right? Very easy. You can go back, find all my blogs. Well, what I like to be able to do, maybe I like to be able to retrieve a specific blog, right? And we knew what the URL was. I forget, what was it? Find blog, was it? And then the ID, so say 23. We know that URL, so let's copy that, grab that, and let's create here. Let's create another one here. Find blog 23. So the URL is something like find blog 23. So let's see the blog. There it is. So I can find all the blogs, or I can retrieve that one blog, right? Now, more interesting would be that instead of hard coding it, be nice instead if I could maybe pass the that 23 as an argument, right? Maybe a form element that I can type in the URL. So why don't we do that, right? So for instance, this could be, instead of this, maybe a form. Be a form that is going to send our request, as an action, so that we can tell it where to send this to. Okay, and is going to send it to, let's see, where should we send it? How about just find blog? Right, find blog, and then we can create an input form here, where you can type the actual value. We'll call this name blog ID. Okay, and maybe a button here that get this, right? So button, and then we'll say find blog, and this is the type is a submit button. Right, so something like that, where you have an input field, you type in the value, and it goes out to the database to find this data. Where is it going to go? It's going to go to this URL. I'm going to go to this URL. Is there something in that URL? I forget. I don't believe so. Was there? We go to blog now. Is there find blog? There's find blog with something. There's find blog with something, but there's no find blog with nothing. So those are different, right? Those are different. So let's create another one. Public blog, find blog by ID from form. Okay, that is going to be mapped to just find blog. Just find blog. Okay, so where do we get the where do we get the ID? Right? Because we need the ID, right? Integer, the ID. And basically what we like to be able to do is just return whatever this guy does. Right? We're just going to say, we're just going to return whatever find blog by ID does. We're just going to pass the ID down. We just need to retrieve this ID here. Right? And the way we do that is forms pass data differently than they don't pass it as part of the path. They pass it as part of a query. Right? So we can retrieve the query, a request param. The parameter that we're passing is called blog ID. We're going to read that. I'm going to pass the integer, right? And then we're going to return whatever we were doing already, right? Now, we'll practice this quite a bit, so you don't have to remember this, right? You won't be asked about this, right? In no quiz you'll ever be asked about any of this, right? I'm just trying to introduce you to possibilities on what you could do with your assignment, with your project, final project. You have to start thinking about, what kind of user interface, how I'm going to integrate with the database. So it's a good time to start thinking about that and meeting with your teams, right, and deciding whether what is it you're going to be building, right? So let's do that. So let's go back. Let's refresh this. Let's see. Let's wait until the server comes up. There we go. So now I can say 23. Let's say find blog, and it returns 23. See that? Or 12. Do I have a 12? Yeah. See that? I can return any blog as a user, as a piece of interface, right? I can look at all the blogs, and I want number 13, or maybe one of the later ones that we built, maybe this one, 22. So I can say, retrieve number 22, find blog, and it comes back with number 22. See that? Okay. So yeah, let's do a couple more. How about I want to maybe create a new blog. So let's create a new blog. Or let's do something simpler, delete a blog, right? So delete a blog. So let's go back here and something similar. And we're going to just copy this form element and we want to delete a blog. So delete. So we'll say here delete blog, and we'll pass in the ID of the blog. Same thing. In the DAO for the deletion, where is the delete blog? It's this one over here. We're going to map it. We're going to say public integer delete blog from form or from UI, maybe, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, from the UI. And we're just going to return the same thing as this blog over here. We're going to return, right, and pass in the blog ID, the integer, blog ID. I'm going to return that. Mapped to return. What's wrong with this? Delete blog. What does it like? Add exception. Oh, okay. There's an exception. Unhandled class not found. Okay, add it. There we go. All right, so where do we get these blog ID? Same thing as before, right? We're going to say get and it's delete blog. And then we're going to get this from the request parameter, which is called what? I think it's called blog ID, right? Yeah, blog ID. Okay, so let's try that. We need to restart the server. It's still starting up. There we go. So let's see all the blogs. Maybe let's remove this. Let's remove a couple more down here. Maybe this one, blog 59, right? So the ID is 18. Let's go back. Delete number 18. Delete. Came back as 1. Let's go find all blogs, and we'll see that number 18 is gone. See that? And let's do a create. Let's create a blog. Okay, let's create a blog. So in the blog, if you want to create a new blog, then this will be, say, create blog. And we can have maybe 2 input fields, right? One is for the name of the blog, and the other one might be for the topic of the blog, right? And then create blog. Okay, and we have to create a wrapper for that in the DAO. So in the create blog here, we're going to have a public integer create blog, which takes the same parameters, right? The string name and string topic. And it's going to return the same thing as the create blog that we already have, and pass in the name and the topic. Okay. Return, blah, 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 return, yeah, okay. And what is it complaining about? Create blog. Create blog is already defined. Oh, I'm sorry, from UI. And this returns the signature, okay? And we're going to map it to create blog, but without this. So from the UI, we retrieve it from the request. So our request parameter called same name and the same topic. So if we restart, we go back, and let's go back and let's refresh. Now we can create a blog. We can create a blog, and we can call it blog 123, and the topic is cars. Okay, so create the blog. Let's go back and let's refresh and see all the blogs. Let's see. There's my brand new blog that I just created, blog 123. Make sense? Like final, let's do an update. Let's do an update. Let's see, updates down here. Right, so this will be public integer update blog from UI that is going to call update blog, and we're going to pass it the ID and the name, which we're going to get. ID is an integer, ID, and the name is a string that we're going to get from the URL. Okay, update blog. This needs to throw an exception as well. And we're going to read our ID and our brand new name. We'll grab it from the request. So request parameter ID and name. And the HTML, it'll look very similar to our create blog. This will be update blog. We need the ID and the name. All right, that's what you're expecting, the IDs and the name. And this would be update blog. Okay. All right, excellent. So let's restart the server and let's see if we can update something. So let's update the blog we just created. I think we called it blog 123. We'll call it blog 234. Okay, so let's refresh. Let's go back. So this is our update blog. And what was the find all blogs? So the last one was this blog 123. So that's ID number 24. So ID number 24, and instead of blog 123, we'll say it's called blog 234. Let's update. Let's refresh, and indeed notice that we've updated it. Okay. All right, excellent. So there we have it, right? So we were able to definitely connect to the database using a low-level JDBC, right? Implementing all the CRUD operations. Obviously, that you can have many more operations, but those are the more common ones, the most trivial ones to implement. You'll probably be asked to implement something much more substantial, much more interesting. We then showed you how we can export that, right, and make it available through a standard protocol such as HTTP, and then so that other folks could integrate with it, whether these are phone applications that are connecting to a remote server and retrieving data or creating new accounts or new records or whatever, right? This is typically how it would be done, right? If you're implementing any phone application or any type of application, especially if it's a remote application, not a desktop, but a remote, especially a mobile application, typically the connection will be back from implementing your user interface, generating some JSON data that is being passed over Wi-Fi or broadband, so that it can be executed remotely in a database, right? And then you see the results coming back, and back and forth. Typically, the protocol will be HTTP, and it will be JSON, right? Data going back and forth, right? They're interacting with relational databases or not, right? You will know what it is. You don't care as a user interface. You don't really care as long as it's exposed with a standard protocol. Okay. Anyway, yeah, there'll be an assignment for you to play around with some of this, and next week we'll revisit this. This is a little bit too low level, and there's too many minutia and too many little things happening. We're going to revisit this and try to package it in an easier way, in a higher level package, right? So that you don't have to deal with so many moving parts. Okay, and so that'll be the topic for next week. Okay. Anyway, any questions? All right then. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Oh, if you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure you give it a thumbs up. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor.
Thanks, Professor.